A lot of times I've been known to bemoan this disconnect between scientific evidence and actual action and meaningful behavior change and like systemic policy change, etc. One big example that comes to mind is climate change. The scientific evidence is, says something, and then we are doing something that is not in accordance with that as a society. And I'm speaking about the US in particular. I can't obviously speak for how this happens around the world, although I suspect in many countries it's similar. And as much as I get frustrated with that disconnect, I think as scientists we have to look in the mirror to some degree, because we have not in the past done the best by our participants and also thinking about the general public. And when we do acts of misconduct, when we fabricate our results or put participants in harm, under conditions of harm, then the public has a right to view us with less credibility. They have justification to see us as people who are not aligned with their interests. And so there are so many examples of this that I'm going to go over just 2 or 3 of them. But first, there was Martin Seligman, who is the happiness researcher, and he abused dogs for his original research. So he mistreated animals in his lab, and I will let you Google that on your own if you're interested, because it's so gruesome that it's actually difficult to talk about. But it's even worse, obviously, that these types of tactics were also used on suspected quote-unquote terrorists by our government in the Bush-Cheney administration. And Martin Seligman actually, even though he did horrific things to animals, his intent with those findings of the research was for the good of people. So he's on record clearly stating that he, all of the things that he did were in service of helping human well-being. And so, however, the way that he mistreated dogs and created a learned helplessness in dogs was of great interest to the U.S. government, because with the methods of torture that they were doing, they didn't want, of course, those methods to be used on our soldiers and agents. And so they wanted to put our people through training so as to be able to endure more torture without disclosing information to enemies. And so that is what they said it was for. However, they used Seligman's work in order to learn better techniques to torture suspected quote-unquote terrorists. And so this is located, the source, if you care to read about it, is in the New York Times link below this slide in the notes. And Martin Seligman, to his credit, said at the end of all this, "I never intended my work to be used this way." And in fact, the APA was approached by the Bush administration to help them do this work. And so the APA had to issue a big apology. You can Google that on APA apology. I was very disappointed. This was just back in 2014, so not that long ago, where they issued that apology, I believe, somewhere in that time period. And I was extremely disappointed in APA at the time, and this was a big deal that everybody was talking about, like, why do we still get entangled in this kind of thing when we clearly have ethical guidelines stating that we do no harm, and yet we're still, as APA as an institution and as researchers, we're still doing harm. Now, Johns Hopkins had a lead paint study back in the 1990s, and this was in the neighborhoods of Baltimore. They were low income, primarily black people living there, and it was a low income housing, I believe, where they had been built in these homes that had been built in the 50s with lead paint. And lead paint is extremely toxic. We know this. In fact, they knew this way before they did the 1990s study. And side note, lead causes neurological problems, it causes violence in people and all kinds of psychological issues. And primarily people are exposed to it in low-income places. So this is a egregious injustice that continues in our society. There's a lot of lead in our water system because we haven't updated our infrastructure. Another thing that we refuse to do as a country and value as a society is getting our infrastructure up to par. And so, long story short, the researchers from Johns Hopkins they wanted to understand what is the minimal amount of lead cleanup that we can do to still protect health of children. And so this was a study, I guess these people were commissioned to make sure that hardly any money was spent on lead cleanup, because their job was literally to determine a baseline, a minimum bar, so to speak, of lead cleanup that had to be done so that so the city or whoever, I don't remember, whoever was supposed to clean this up did not have to do any more than was absolutely necessary. So these homes, they had people come in to live there, and they exposed them to 4 or 5 levels of lead cleanup. So some people had completely cleaned up and had no lead at present, and then gradations all the way down to a lot of lead. And the people who were living there were Black people who had children and who were not informed about the lead exposure. And somebody found out about it. I don't know all the details, but they were sued, and the courts had them pay out and then gave them a very rough lecture about what ethics in science means. And I think one of the judges said something to the effect of, Johns Hopkins is an institution where you researchers don't care as much about ethics and the people you're serving, but you care more about the results of your study, basically. And unfortunately, that points to a misalignment for us scientists, where the incentives are not aligned for us to care about the people we're serving and the general public and the accuracy of the body of knowledge, but more about fame for us as researchers, our citations, our conference presentations, and just the accolades. So scientists are unfortunately rewarded for a lot of the wrong things if we are trying to increase trust, the public trust. Mark Hauser is just another example of a researcher at Harvard. I forgot what he did exactly. He was like a cognitive evolution scientist, and his graduate students blew the whistle, actually. Blow the whistle just means that they reported to the public of the research misconduct going on in their lab. So specifically, there was some fabrication of data and falsification of data, where fabrication is you completely make up data, and falsification is where you just tweak the existing data and you do it in a way that's dishonest. And so they had a couple of coders who were observing like monkey behavior for a study, and when they made their ratings, he actually went after the fact they found out and changed the ratings and reported something different. And that was probably because the results that the coders were, their ratings just weren't in accordance with the theory or whatever he expected to see, and what he knew, more importantly, what he knew would get into a journal, right? Because it's all about, for us, publications. Otherwise, you're dismissed. Basically, you don't keep your job unless you're publishing as a scientist. And when you see the results aren't turning out the way, you have to desperately think of another story, fit another theory, slap another theory on top of it. If it still doesn't work, then you're tempted to, as a researcher, falsify things. So as far as human rights of participants, we have an institutional review board at SPU, and each institution has one who does scientific research that's published or presented anywhere. And its first responsibility, the people on that committee, that body, their first responsibility is to protect the research participants, and that's why if you've submitted an IRB here at SPU, you know it's kind of a long process. There's a lot of different things to know, and of course all of us have had to go through the research ethics training before we do research. And there's a lot of responsibility that goes with this. There's a lot of weight on us. As graduate students and faculty, we represent SPU. We might as well just be wearing the SPU swag all the time, wherever we go, announcing we are from SPU. And that means that people will view SPU and judge the whole institution based on our behavior and if we are acting honorably with how we treat human subjects, of course, and then reporting and disseminating our findings.